Within minutes, alarm klaxons echoed through Soviet air defense installations across the Urals. Tracking stations confirmed the contact, a single aircraft traveling southwest at approximately 460 miles per hour, deep inside Soviet airspace. The altitude made identification impossible through visual means. Soviet fighters scrambled but struggled to reach even 50,000 feet. The intruder flew in a realm where the sky turned dark purple and the curvature of Earth became visible, beyond the reach of conventional aircraft, seemingly untouchable. Then, at 08:53 hours, the blip flickered. The radar return weakened, wavered, and vanished. Controllers stared at their screens, adjusting settings, checking equipment. The aircraft had simply disappeared, not descended, not turned, simply ceased to exist on their displays as if it had never been there at all. In Washington, CIA headquarters received the first indication something had gone wrong when the scheduled radio check from the aircraft failed to arrive. The U-2 reconnaissance mission, designated Operation Grand Slam, had been planned for weeks. The pilot, Francis Gary Powers, was experienced, professional, had flown multiple missions over Soviet territory. His route would take him from Peshawar, Pakistan, across the Soviet Union to Bodo, Norway, photographing ICBM sites, military installations, and industrial complexes. The mission duration was calculated at 9 hours. Communications would be minimal to reduce detection risk. When Powers failed to report at the designated checkpoint, concern rippled through the CIA's operations center. Equipment malfunction was possible. Radio failure occurred occasionally at those altitudes, but as hours passed without contact, without emergency signals, without any indication of the aircraft's status, concern transformed into dread. The U-2 carried the most sophisticated camera systems ever built, classified navigation equipment, and survival gear that included detailed maps of Soviet territory. If the aircraft had crashed inside the Soviet Union, if the Soviets recovered any of that equipment, if they captured the pilot alive, the consequences would extend far beyond the loss of one airplane. They thought it was just a spy plane, a routine intelligence gathering flight, one of dozens that had penetrated Soviet airspace over the previous 4 years, until it vanished from radar. And when the truth emerged, it would expose not just the aircraft, but the entire architecture of American espionage operations, the vulnerability of high-altitude reconnaissance, and the fragility of Cold War diplomacy balanced on a foundation of mutual deception. The story of the U-2 began not with the aircraft, but with a problem that had haunted American intelligence since the dawn of the Cold War. The Soviet Union was a closed society, vast and secretive, developing nuclear weapons and long-range missiles behind an iron curtain that prevented traditional intelligence gathering. Human agents were difficult to insert and frequently compromised. Defectors provided valuable information, but couldn't offer the comprehensive, verifiable intelligence that American military planners demanded. The fundamental question remained unanswered. How many nuclear weapons did the Soviets possess? Where were they located? How advanced were Soviet missile programs? Aerial reconnaissance offered a potential solution, but existing aircraft couldn't penetrate Soviet airspace without being intercepted. Soviet air defenses had improved dramatically since World War II. Fighters could reach 50,000 feet. Surface-to-air missiles were becoming operational. Any reconnaissance aircraft would need to fly higher than Soviet defenses could reach, fast enough to avoid interception, with cameras capable of photographing military installations from extreme altitude, with sufficient resolution to identify specific equipment. In 1954, the CIA approached Lockheed's Advanced Development Projects Division, known as Skunk Works, with specifications that seemed impossible. An aircraft capable of sustained flight above 70,000 feet, range exceeding 4,000 miles, capable of carrying a camera payload weighing hundreds of pounds. The project leader, Clarence Kelly Johnson, was already legendary in aviation circles for designing the P-38 Lightning and the F-104 Starfighter. He assembled a team of engineers and gave them an impossible deadline: design and build the aircraft in 8 months. The resulting aircraft, designated U-2, represented radical compromises between performance and practicality. To achieve the required altitude, Johnson created essentially a powered glider. The wingspan exceeded 80 feet, larger than many bombers, mounted on a fuselage barely longer than 60 feet. The single Pratt & Whitney J57 turbojet engine, modified for high-altitude operation, provided barely enough thrust. The aircraft had no ejection seat, no defensive weapons, minimal electronics beyond navigation and communication equipment. The landing gear consisted of a bicycle configuration, with detachable wheels under the wings that fell away on takeoff. The U-2 was fragile, difficult to fly, and operated at the edge of the flight envelope where the margin between stalling and structural failure measured in mere knots. Pilots called it the Dragon Lady, temperamental and unforgiving. At 70,000 feet, the aircraft flew in what pilots termed the coffin corner, where the speed required to maintain lift was nearly identical to the speed that would cause structural failure. Any deviation, any unexpected turbulence, any control input too aggressive could result in catastrophic loss of control. The first U-2 flew in August 1955 from a remote airfield in Nevada known officially as Groom Lake, unofficially as Area 51. The location had been selected for its isolation, surrounded by restricted military test ranges where aircraft could be developed and tested away from observation. The U-2 program was classified at the highest levels. Pilots were recruited from Strategic Air Command, told only that they would be flying classified missions requiring exceptional skill. Training took place in complete secrecy. The first operational missions over the Soviet Union began in July 1956, flown from bases in West Germany and Turkey. The results exceeded expectations. Camera systems, developed specifically for the U-2, could photograph a strip of territory 200 miles wide with resolution sufficient to identify individual vehicles. In a single 9-hour mission, a U-2 could gather more intelligence about Soviet military installations than months of agent reports. Soviet leaders, including Premier Nikita Khrushchev, were enraged by the overflights. Soviet radar detected the aircraft immediately, tracked them across thousands of miles of Soviet territory, but possessed no means to intercept them. Fighters scrambled, but couldn't reach the U-2's operating altitude. Early surface-to-air missiles lacked the range and guidance systems necessary to engage targets above 60,000 feet. The overflights represented a humiliating demonstration of Soviet inability to defend their own airspace. Khrushchev protested through diplomatic channels, but the protests remained private. Publicly acknowledging the overflights would mean admitting Soviet air defenses were inadequate, a propaganda disaster for a regime that claimed technological equality with the West. The Soviets accelerated development of high-altitude interceptors and improved surface-to-air missile systems. But American intelligence assessments concluded the U-2 remained invulnerable to Soviet defenses. President Eisenhower, though recognizing the intelligence value of U-2 missions, grew increasingly concerned about the political risks. Each overflight violated Soviet sovereignty, provided Khrushchev with legitimate grounds for protest, and risked a confrontation that could escalate beyond control. By 1960, Eisenhower had restricted U-2 operations, requiring personal presidential authorization for each mission over Soviet territory. The mission planned for May 1, 1960, received Eisenhower's reluctant approval based on CIA assurances that it would be the final deep penetration flight before an upcoming summit meeting between Eisenhower and Khrushchev in Paris. The intelligence targets included suspected ICBM facilities at Plesetsk and Yuria, submarine construction facilities, and nuclear research installations. The route covered over 2,900 miles of Soviet territory, the deepest penetration ever attempted. Francis Gary Powers, The selected pilot was 30 years old, a former Air Force fighter pilot recruited into the CIA's U-2 program in 1956. He had flown 27 missions over Soviet territory without incident. The briefing for Operation Grand Slam emphasized the routine nature of the flight. Soviet defenses would detect the aircraft but couldn't reach it. The mission would take approximately 9 hours. Weather conditions were favorable. Recovery at Bodu would be straightforward. Powers took off from Peshawar at 0620 local time. The U-2 climbed to its cruising altitude of 70,500 feet and turned northeast toward the Soviet border. Powers activated the camera systems, checked his oxygen supply, settled into the mission routine. Below him, Soviet radar stations began tracking the intruder, feeding information to Air Defense Command. What American intelligence didn't know was that Soviet air defenses had improved dramatically in the months since the last deep penetration mission. The SA-2 Guideline surface-to-air missile system had become operational, specifically designed to engage high-altitude targets. The system remained untested against actual U-2 aircraft, but Soviet engineers believed they had solved the technical challenges of engaging targets above 60,000 feet. As Powers crossed into Soviet airspace near Dushanbe, Soviet Air Defense Command issued orders to engage. SA-2 batteries near Sverdlovsk prepared to fire. Soviet fighters, including the experimental Su-9, scrambled to intercept, though they remained thousands of feet below the U-2's altitude. The plan called for the SA-2 missiles to force the aircraft lower, where fighters could engage. At 08:53 Moscow time, an SA-2 battery near Sverdlovsk achieved radar lock and launched. Powers, monitoring his instruments, had no warning. The U-2 carried no radar warning receiver, no defensive systems. The first indication of danger was a tremendous explosion behind the aircraft. The missile's proximity fuse had detonated 50 meters from the U-2, sending shrapnel through the fragile airframe. Powers felt the aircraft shudder, heard the explosion, saw the control panel disintegrate. The U-2 began breaking apart, the wings separating from the fuselage, the entire structure coming apart in the thin air. Powers, unable to activate the destruct system designed to destroy classified equipment, struggled to escape the disintegrating aircraft. The force of the breakup threw him partially clear. His parachute deployed automatically at 15,000 feet. Soviet forces tracked the descending parachute, immediately dispatching ground units to the projected landing site. Powers landed in a field near the village of Korsulino, approximately 1,300 miles inside Soviet territory. Within minutes, KGB officers and military personnel surrounded him. He was captured alive, essentially uninjured, still wearing his pressure suit, carrying survival equipment, including 4,000 rubles, gold coins, jewelry, maps marked with Soviet military installations, and a poison pin he had chosen not to use. The wreckage of the U-2 scattered across several square miles, but critical components survived relatively intact. Soviet engineers recovered the camera systems, with exposed film showing Soviet military installations. They found navigation equipment, communication devices, and enough physical evidence to prove beyond question that this was an American reconnaissance aircraft engaged in espionage deep inside Soviet territory. In Washington, the initial assumption was that Powers had died in the crash, that the U-2 and its equipment had been destroyed. The CIA activated its cover story. On May 3rd, NASA announced that a weather research aircraft operated by the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics had gone missing over Turkey after the pilot reported oxygen system difficulties. The statement described the aircraft as engaged in high-altitude atmospheric research, an unfortunate accident with no political implications. On May 5th, Khrushchev addressed the Supreme Soviet and demolished the American cover story with theatrical precision. He announced that Soviet forces had shot down an American spy plane. He revealed the aircraft's mission, its photographic equipment, its route across Soviet territory. Then, in a moment calculated for maximum effect, he announced that the pilot was alive, in Soviet custody, and had confessed to espionage. The announcement created immediate crisis. President Eisenhower, who had approved the mission, was directly implicated in espionage operations against a nation with which the United States maintained diplomatic relations. Secretary of State Christian Hurta attempted damage control, claiming the president hadn't specifically authorized this particular flight, a statement that was technically false and politically disastrous. Khrushchev, recognizing the propaganda advantage, milked the incident for everything possible. Powers was paraded before Soviet media, shown standing next to wreckage of his aircraft. The Soviets displayed recovered equipment, including the high-resolution cameras, detailed maps, survival gear designed for escape and evasion in Soviet territory. The message was clear. American claims of peaceful intentions were lies. The United States was conducting aggressive espionage operations, violating Soviet sovereignty with impunity. The Paris summit, scheduled for May 16th, collapsed before it began. Khrushchev demanded an apology from Eisenhower, punishment for those responsible, and a promise to end all reconnaissance flights. Eisenhower refused to apologize, though he did suspend U-2 overflights. The summit ended in acrimony, with Khrushchev storming out, declaring that productive diplomacy was impossible with a government that conducted espionage while professing peaceful intentions. Powers faced trial in Moscow in August 1960, charged with espionage. The trial was a propaganda spectacle, broadcast internationally, designed to embarrass the United States. Powers, following instructions to cooperate if captured, answered questions honestly about his mission. He was sentenced to 10 years, 3 in prison, and 7 in a labor camp. The sentence was lighter than expected, suggesting Soviet willingness to eventually negotiate an exchange. The U-2 incident transformed Cold War espionage. The myth of invulnerability through altitude had been shattered. Surface-to-air missiles had proven capable of reaching aircraft that were supposed to be untouchable. The political costs of manned reconnaissance over hostile territory had been demonstrated in humiliating detail. The American response was technological. The CIA had already begun developing the successor to the U-2, an aircraft that would be truly invulnerable, not through altitude, but through speed. The A-12 Oxcart and its Air Force variant, the SR-71 Blackbeard, could fly at Mach 3.2, so fast that even if detected, no missile system could intercept it. The aircraft would cruise at 85,000 feet, higher than the U-2, but speed was its primary defense. Simultaneously, American intelligence agencies accelerated satellite reconnaissance programs. Corona satellites, already in development, offered surveillance capabilities without the political risks of manned overflights. By 1961, satellites were returning intelligence imagery comparable to U-2 photography, with none of the vulnerability. Powers remained imprisoned until February 1962, when he was exchanged for Soviet KGB Colonel Rudolf Abel in a carefully choreographed swap on the Glienicke Bridge in Berlin. Powers returned to mixed reception. Some viewed him as a hero who had survived an impossible situation. Others questioned why he hadn't used the suicide device, hadn't destroyed his aircraft, had cooperated with Soviet interrogators. The CIA debriefing cleared him of any wrongdoing, but the public controversy followed him for years. The U-2 itself continued flying, though never again over the Soviet Union. The aircraft proved adaptable to other missions, flying reconnaissance over Cuba during the missile crisis of 1962, over China, over conflict zones worldwide. Modified and upgraded, U-2s remain in service today, nearly 70 years after Kelly Johnson's team designed them, a testament to the fundamental soundness of the basic design. The incident crystallized the Cold War's essential paradox. Both sides engaged in espionage. Both sides knew the other was spying. But maintaining the fiction of normal diplomatic relations required pretending the espionage wasn't happening. The U-2 shoot-down stripped away that pretense. It forced public acknowledgement of activities that had previously remained in shadows. It demonstrated that Cold War competition occurred not just through diplomatic channels and proxy conflicts, but through systematic violation of sovereignty, through technology pushed to extremes, through risks that could spiral into open conflict. The radar operators who tracked that faint blip on May 1st, 1960, watching it vanish from their screens, couldn't have known they were witnessing the end of an era. The age of manned reconnaissance aircraft penetrating hostile airspace at high altitude was ending, killed by the same missile technology that had seemed too primitive to pose a threat. The future belonged to satellites, to unmanned systems, to intelligence gathered from orbit where no nation's sovereignty extended. They thought it was just a spy plane, another U-2 on another reconnaissance mission, routine in execution, if not in purpose. But when it vanished from radar, when the truth emerged about the shoot-down, the capture, the political humiliation, it revealed something fundamental about the Cold War. The conflict was being fought in dimensions beyond traditional warfare. In the thin air above 70,000 feet, where the sky turned black and the earth curved away beneath, nations competed for information, for advantage, for the knowledge that might prevent or win a war that both sides desperately hoped to avoid. Francis Gary Powers died in 1977, piloting a television news helicopter that crashed in California. The U-2 he flew on May 1st, 1960, remained scattered across a Soviet field, eventually recovered by Soviet authorities and displayed in museums as proof of American aggression. The SR-71 that replaced the U-2 flew its last mission in 1999, itself made obsolete by satellites and reconnaissance drones. The cycle of technology, deployment, vulnerability, and replacement continued, driven by the same imperatives that had launched Powers on his final mission. The incident left one indelible lesson. In the Cold War, there were no routine missions, no safe operations, no guarantees that technology would remain ahead of countermeasures. The aircraft that couldn't be shot down was shot down. The pilot who couldn't be captured was captured. The cover story that seemed plausible was demolished. And the summit that might have reduced tensions collapsed because of a single aircraft vanishing from radar over the Soviet Union. They thought it was just a spy plane, until it wasn't. Until it became proof that the Cold War was real, dangerous, fought in shadows and in the stratosphere, where one aircraft, one missile, one captured pilot could change the course of history. The beeping radar return that disappeared on May 1st, 1960, marked more than the loss of an aircraft. It marked the moment when Cold War espionage stopped being theoretical and became undeniably, dangerously real.